If you want confirmation of the correctness of the Benko gambit, take a look at the players who play it. World champion Kasparov uses the opening frequently. So do Gelfand, Adams, Fedorowicz and Hodgson. They can't all be wrong. In fact, such is the strength of Black's position in the Benko gambit accepted that most top players today decline the gambit. They don't regard acceptance of the gambit pawn as a particularly practical proposition if they want to win. The gambit is introduced by the following moves. White plays 1d4, Black knight f6, White plays 2c4, and Black goes 2c5. White pushes on, 3d5, and now Black plays 3b7 to b5. White takes on b5, for c takes b5, and now Black plays a6, gambiting a pawn. And when White takes on a6, that's 5b takes a6, we get the typical position for the Benko gambit accepted. Black can take on a6 immediately, but it's more accurate to play g6 first. And this is the current choice of virtually all the grandmasters who play the gambit. That's 5g6. White generally responds 6 knight c3, and only then does Black take on a6, having avoided some dangerous White options. Now I'm going to divide the theory into three major sections. In the first section, White will fianchetto his king-bishop. In the second section, White will play for an early e4, and in the third section, White will try to prepare the move e4 by playing either knight f3 to d2 or f4 followed by knight f3. Take a look at this position. Black has no less than 4 lines of attack against the White pawn structure. Firstly, and most importantly, Black will attack with his major pieces on both the A and B files. He's going to put his queen on either b6 or a5, and in each case follow up with rook f to b8. There you see the Black major pieces powering down the A and B files. Added to this strong pressure on the A and B files, Black has 2 tremendous diagonals for his bishops. The a6 bishop, as you can see, is very strong, putting pressure on the e2 pawn, and Black has only to move his knight from f6. Let's put it on e8, and then you can see the bishop on g7 also has a tremendous future. So Black's operating on the A and B files with his major pieces, and his bishops are zigzagging into White's position, putting pressure on e2 and b2, the sensitive pawns. Having said that, it's not as straightforward as it seems to attack the White position. The knights have a very important role to play if Black is to mount a successful attack. Let's take all the knights off the board as an experiment and put Black's major pieces on the queenside files as indicated earlier. Now take a look at the position. I would say Black's game has improved dramatically with the exchange of all the knights, mainly because it's very difficult for White to hold his queenside together at this point. The knight on c3 was obstructing Black along the diagonal, the long diagonal, and Black simply got rid of it. Therefore the pressure against b2 is now very, very strong, and it's really difficult for White to hold his game together should all the knights get exchanged off the board. Black has various ways to achieve his goal of exchanging the knights. Let's see some of them. One manoeuvre from the diagram position is knight e8 to c7 and then knight to b5. That's a rather long-winded manoeuvre, but Black often employs this idea. Another idea is knight d7 to b6 and then to a4. Although in this case the bishop on a6 impedes Black a little, so presumably if Black were to go through with this knight manoeuvre, the light square bishops would have been taken off the board a little bit earlier. Finally, if we give White a couple of moves here, rook e1 and then e4, another idea for Black is to play knight f6 to g4. The point of this is that if White now plays h3, the knight drops back to e5. Knight takes knight by white, and then black captures knight takes knight. This time black has exchanged off white's king's knight, but the knight on e5 is becoming a very powerful piece, entrenching itself in white's position on either d3 or c4, and in each case we see the harmonious coordination of black's pieces against the white queen side. It may seem surprising that black takes great pains to exchange off the pieces, but it's a paradox of the Benko gambit that with each exchange of knights, black's position improves. Take a look at this position. I'm playing black against international master Andrew Muir at the British Championship 1985. Who stands better in this position? Black's pieces are certainly active, but he's still a pawn down. I decided to attack before white could activate the rook on a1. So black played queen f5 with a double attack. White played rook d2, and black played rook e8, hitting the queen. The queen went to c3. Black's rook went into e4, and white tried to get his rook active on a1 by playing the defensive move a3 first. Right, now we're reaching a position where white's threatening to activate the rook, so black must attack. h5 was played. King g2. And black played the strong attacking move, rook on a8 to a4. White now activated the rook on a1, rook a d1, and black continued with the initiative by playing h4. Now it's getting really difficult for white. What he should probably play is queen f3, but he made the understandable mistake of playing g4. Okay, white's still a pawn up, but look at his king side, full of holes. So, queen g5, presumably threatening f5. White played f3, and black played the strong move rook e5. Well, suddenly white's lost. The threat now is queen f4 to g3. And it's really difficult for white to defend against that. Maybe it's impossible. Muir tried f4, but after rook takes f4, rook f1, rook takes f1, king takes f1, rook e3, white was forced to resign. The queen is attacked on c3, white's pawn is attacked on h3, and black's queen is threatening to infiltrate with queen to f4. All of these threats combined give white a totally lost position. Here's a second instructive example of black's play. It comes from the old game between Mecking and Szabo, played in 1970 in Buenos Aires. In those days, players tended to accept the gambit. Now this may seem an old game to you, but at the time, these were two of the best players in the world, and the quality of play is high. Black's a pawn down, he's got his active pieces on the queen side, white's pawn structure is a little bit loose, and the rook on a3 is passive. All things considered, black is probably slightly better here. Mecking saw a tactic, and he played a5. Now you could argue this is a strong move in the sense that white's trying to do something for the poor rook on a3, but in fact tactically it turns out to be weak because the pawn on a5 soon becomes indefensible. Black responded rook b5, hitting the pawn, and white showed his idea. He played queen c4. Black played rook a8. And white went b4. Okay, a purely tactical move, but black had a good response. Rook takes a5. Now, white's queen is under attack. So he had to exchange off the queens. Queen takes a6. Black played rook 5 takes a6. Rook takes a6. And then rook takes a6. Taking stock of the situation, we see that the only difference between the two positions is that white's position is much looser than black's. And this is a common theme in Benko gambit endings. Suddenly, black wins back his pawn, his position's together, white's position's very loose. Look at the knight on a2, the rook on e3, the white pawn structure, just ready to be attacked. Of course, the move white would like to play now is b takes c5, but as that loses the knight, white can't do it. If the knight moves on a2, white loses the pawn on b4. So white's next move is forced, but it's a rather horrible move to have to play. Mecking played rook e2. Well, I spoke about the looseness of white's position, so it's not surprising now that black has a tactic which ruins white's game. Szabo played knight takes e4. B takes c5. And black took back with the d pawn. D takes c5. Well, Mecking took one look at this position and thought, a few moves ago I was a pawn up, now I'm a pawn down. Black threatens f5, my knight on a2 is rubbish, I may as well just take my chances in the rook ending. But that wasn't good enough. He played rook takes e4, rook takes a2 check, king f3, strong move by black now, rook a3 check, driving the white king back, king g2, and black played king f8. Rook c4 was played, black defended with rook a5, king f3, king e8, and Mecking saw the king coming to d6. He tried to do something by playing f5, g takes f5, king f4, king d7, king takes f5, king d6. White's d pawn is now dropping, really difficult. He tried rook h4, but after king takes d5, rook takes h5, king d4, it becomes totally clear that white is lost. Black's threatening c4 check. If white defends against that, he's got to cope with the threats of king d3, followed by the advance of the c-pawn. It's all a bit much. So very few moves completed the game. Mecking played king g4, rook a6, rook h8, c4, king f3, king d3, and white resigned. Hopeless position. Black can play his rook across to d6, covering the king, and simply advances c-pawn to the end. So there you have it. An excellent example of Benko gambit endgame play, where black exploits his superior pawn structure. Don't forget, at the start of this example, Mecking was a pawn up, but after pushing his queenside pawns, he loosened his position and black was in like a shot. My final introductory snapshot is an illustration of loose pawn structure. It comes from a game between Andre, a French IM, and John Fedorowicz, one of the world's leading exponents of the Benko in Grandmaster play. Fedorowicz was black, and it came from a tournament in Holland played in 1989. Now you can see that white's adopted a very aggressive stance in the opening. He's pushed his pawns up and deliberately kept his king in the middle. In particular, he wants to play his king to c2 to defend b2. This is very unusual. Fedorowicz tried to exploit the strange position of the white king by playing knight g4. Now, we know that threatens a fork on f2, but that's not the main point. White played king c2, and now a very strong move by black, c5 to c4. Now we can see that the position of the white king on c2 is not so great, because black has numerous threats here. The main one is knight c5 to d3. We saw something like this in our earlier example, this particular manoeuvre. Putting the knight back on d7, if we couple this idea with rook to b8, then you can see the pressure mounting against the queenside, in particular b2 once again. Maybe in this type of position the rook on a6 can go to b6, and there's even more pressure there. White's got to be very careful here, defending against all these black threats. So after this very strong move, white played rook h to e1. And not surprisingly, there came knight c5. White put his rook on e1 to be able to play now rook e2. And then black played his knight into d3, as we expected. Pawn to h3. And Fedorowicz just dropped back, knight to f6. Well, as the knight on d3 is fouling white's position up completely, Andrei decided to try and exchange it off. And this explains his next move, knight e1. Fedorowicz felt that it was probably a good idea to retain the knight, so he played knight d3 to c5. But in his own notes of the game, he mentions another possibility which he felt was stronger. And that is rook to b8. After all, that's a perfectly natural move. Then comes knight takes d3, c takes d3 check, king takes d3, rook takes b2, rook b1, rook takes b1, knight takes b1, and then rook takes a2. Fedorowicz feels that black is better here, and I have to agree with him, for several reasons. Firstly, the rook on a2 is much more active than the rook on e2. Furthermore, black threatens knight d7 to c5, putting pressure against the white king. And the final point, and common point in the Benko, is that black's pawn structure is simply better than white's. It's more compact, it's more flexible, and the white pawns are there ready to be attacked, whereas it's difficult to say the same for black. So all these things combined mean that probably Fedorowicz after knight e1 should have played this variation. Back at the game, Fedorowicz chose knight c5, and the Frenchman lashed out with e5. Now, whether this was an attacking gesture or merely an attempt to keep the bishop on g7 under control is difficult to say, but it does continue to make white's pawn structure extremely loose. Black played knight fd7, just dropping back, and white played bishop e3. Now black's rook came across to b8, rook b8. So what have we got here? We've got the usual Benko gambit pressure with white's king in the firing line. Can this be good for white? I very much doubt it. Bishop takes c5. Of course, black takes back with the knight. Knight takes c5. And white played rook d1. Now comes a move which should be familiar to you. Fedorowicz played knight a4. Right, double attack, hitting the pawn at b2 and the knight on c3. So knight takes a4. Rook takes a4. Now we reach a critical position. What white probably should play now is the very defensive move a3. Fedorowicz then gives c3, exposing the white king further. King takes c3. Rook takes f4. Knight d3. And then rook a4. Feeling that black holds the advantage because of white's exposed king. But he feels white had to play like this he had to take his chances in this position, because after all, if white survives the attack, then he's got two passed pawns on the queen side to look forward to. It's doubtful, however, whether with his king on c3 he could actually survive, because the king will probably have to backpedal and then black's going to win the e-pawn. So with a3 missed, Andre played rook a1, a horrible move. I mean, you don't want to play moves like that, do you? And black played rook a5, exposing white's d-pawn, which Andre gratuitously weakened when he played e4, e5. King c3, rook takes d5, king takes c4, e6. Well, still a pawn down, black, but look at that pressure. Tremendous pressure from the rooks. The only developed white piece really is the king. White tried to bring his knight back into the game with knight f3. Rook c8 check. King went to b3. And then rook b5 check. King a4. And rook c b8. Well, would you like to be in this position with white? No, neither would I. Well, it's not surprising that under such pressure, the end came quickly. Andre now cracked up under the pressure, playing e takes d6. Hardly surprising with his king out there like that. And Fedorowicz played rook 5 to b7, with unstoppable mate threats of either rook a7 or rook a8. Proof positive that white can't play like this against the Benko gambit. He has to get his king out of the middle. Before we launch into the main theory of the Benko gambit, let's now summarise the golden rules of the Benko gambit accepted. The first and most important point is that you shouldn't be afraid of exchanging pieces if you're black. Endings tend to favour black, particularly major piece endings. Look at this position and you'll see why. White has an extra pawn, but black's pieces are all very active. The white rooks are actually trapped behind their own pawns. In each of the three snapshots I've shown you, black had extremely active piece play. Key squares that black should be pressurising in the Benko gambit are c4, d3, a2, and in particular b2. This is the most sensitive point in white's position. All of black's pieces tend to come raining down on that square in a well-played Benko gambit accepted. Don't forget how important black's knights are. Remember the manoeuvres knight e8 to c7 to b5, knight b6 to a4, and with a white pawn on h2, knight g4 to e5. Watch out for these ideas at every stage of the game. Remember, if the knights come off the board, this helps you. Here's a position from one of the main lines, and white plays e2, e4. If white allows you the opportunity to exchange your a6 bishop for the f1 bishop, you should definitely take it. In the earlier days of the gambit, many players just left the bishop on the board and allowed white to take on a6. This is not desirable. You take on f1 because you want to keep the white king in the middle. Remember, this is how Andre got into trouble. He kept his king in the middle. If you can take on f1, you should. You often have the opportunity to play pawn to c4, followed by the knight manoeuvre, knight c5 to d3. Each time you do this, you have to watch out for a corresponding knight move by white, and that is knight d4 to c6. Another thing to remember when you go c4 is that white must not be in a position to play b4. Now generally the pawn will be on b3 before you've done this. If white had played b4 in one go, black can play c takes b3 en passant and then hopefully attack white's exposed pawn on the b file. But what you don't want happening is for white to get two protected passed pawns on the queen side. Black must fight against the establishment of these protected passed pawns at all costs. Here you see, more or less, white's ideal pawn structure on the queen side. Pawns on b3 and a4. I guess b3 and a2 is also satisfactory, but there's a hole on a3 which black can occupy and then pile up with major pieces against the a pawn. So this is roughly the best that white can do with his pawns on the queen side. Covering the sensitive pawn on b2 is the key to it. But white can't often attain that because, as you can see, the long diagonal h8 to a1 is totally open. An understanding of pawn structure is also crucial to the Benko gambit. Look at black's pawn structure here and you'll notice that it's very compact. The weak spot, if there is one, is e7. But because that pawn is at the rear of black's position, it's very difficult for white to get at the pawn. It follows that it's very difficult to attack the black pawn formation. Now, although white has an extra pawn in this position, the A and B pawns are actually very easy to attack, and they form the basis for all of black's counterplay. If one of these pawns fall, then the other one tends to go as well, simply because black has all his pieces in the crucial area of the board. So, white's pawn structure, although he's got a pawn extra, is not that strong, and it's a total contrast to black's pawn formation. Having said all that, please remember that if you don't organise your counterplay successfully, white's A pawn is going to win the game. This may seem self-evident, but I've seen some players play the Benko gambit, and it comes as a complete surprise to them when the white pawn advances to a5 and ties their forces down completely. So try and pin the A and B pawns down and win them. Finally, as black, you've got to watch out for white playing e4, e5. This pawn break perhaps holds the key to white's position if he's going to hope for success. But as we saw in the game Andrei Fedorowicz, it wasn't so easy to effect. Obviously white's king was still in the middle in that example. Here, white's king is in a much more secure position. But the time white needs to spend in order to achieve e4, e5 successfully is colossal. By the time he's got e4, e5 in, black's whole army is powering down the queen side. And so it's very difficult to effect this move properly, although it's undoubtedly the move white wants to play if he wants to stifle black's game. First, I'll be looking at lines where white fianchettos his king bishop. The main line is introduced by the following moves. Black has just played g6, and white responds with knight c3. Black plays bishop takes a6. White now plays knight f3. And black plays bishop g7. White plays g3. And black plays d6. Bishop goes to g2. Black castles on the king side. White castles on the king side. And black plays knight b to d7. Now when you come to play the Benko gambit on a regular basis, this black position will become very familiar to you. Black's plan is to put the major pieces on the queen side open files, and then to react accordingly to what white does. There are a number of white moves in this position. We'll first of all deal with 11 queen c2. Basically, in all these fianchetto lines, white is looking for a piece arrangement by which he can consolidate his position. In particular, a way in which he can cover the sensitive queenside pawns. And black will be looking to frustrate his ideal arrangement by placing the major pieces on the A and B files and then manoeuvring his knights, as we saw earlier in the introduction, as appropriate. I'm going to recommend an old approach in this position, and that is queen to b6. The advantage of this move is that it starts to put immediate pressure on white's b2 pawn and threatens to swing the f rook across to b8, giving a battery of queen and rook powering down the b file. Another advantage is that if black ever gets around to playing c5, c4, the black queen can come into play down the diagonal a7 to g1, in particular putting pressure against f2. So white's also got to watch his f2 pawn in this line. Now, white's got to find a satisfactory piece arrangement after queen b6, and he generally plays rook d1. Black plays rook fb8, and white plays rook b1. Now, the choice of these rook moves by white might seem a little bit arbitrary, but black's plan is clear. He's powering down the A and B files. After rook b1, we will follow the game Zouts against Bukal from a tournament in Berlin played in 1984, where black played a very clear idea. He played here knight g4. Alright, if white leaves the knight there, then the knight puts pressure on f2, and black's almost always threatening to go c5, c4. White has two options after knight g4, but both give black a satisfactory game. The first option, and the most obvious move on the board, is h3. Black plays knight e5. White chose to retain his knight by playing 15 knight h2. After that, black played knight c4, and white played knight g4. Now, this is a very peculiar idea, slightly artificial, but Zaltz's idea was that he wanted to support the move bishop c1 to h6 and try and get rid of black's powerful king bishop. This is, however, not a particularly good idea, as you'll see. After knight g4, black continued to step up the pressure with queen to b4. White went through with his plan, bishop h6, and now black played the simplest move on the board, bishop to h8. White went queen e4, and black played knight d to e5. In the end, white had to make a move he could have made several moves earlier. That's knight takes knight. But this time, because of the strong black knight on c4, black was quite happy to capture with the bishop. So he went bishop takes e5. And white played 20 queen h4. Perhaps this is a good time to sum up the position. Black's still a pawn down, and white seems to have some pressure on the king side. But if you look at the position more closely, it's the black pressure against b2 that's about to become critical. Just one more move should convince you that black has an excellent position here. Bukal played knight takes b2. Now the knight on c3 is very poorly placed, unprotected and vulnerable to attack. Notice after black's last move, the knight on b2 has pinned itself against the black queen. But black's numerous threats, for instance, bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, or the simple positional threat of queen takes h4, force a very uncomfortable reply. White played knight e4. Black played f5. Very uncomfortable for white. If he moves his knight, queens come off. Bishop came back to c1. F takes e4. And white played rook d2, hoping to regain the piece. Well, white's opening has turned into a fiasco. The move e3 exposed how poor white's game has become. Queen takes queen. And now rook takes queen. Rook d takes b2. Bishop takes b2. Rook takes b2. All these exchanges are helping black. Black exchanged the rook. Rook takes b2. Bishop takes b2. Rook b8. And white resigned. White's exchange down. If he moves his bishop on b2, black's rook penetrates. Meanwhile, black's also threatening bishop takes e2 or e takes f2 check. All of these threats combined mean that white's game is hopeless. So a very clear-cut demonstration of black's pressure on the queen side. White's second option after knight g4 is the modest move, bishop d2. And this was played in the game Vukic versus Bukic, Sarajevo 1972. Again, black played knight g5, that's his idea when he puts his knight out on g4. And this time, white captured the knight. Knight takes e5, and black played knight takes e5. White didn't like the idea of black's knight coming to c4, and so he stopped it with b3. So to a certain extent, you could say that white is consolidating his position. Black now repositioned the bishop on a6 with the interesting move bishop c8. And white played h3. Black's queen went to a6 and white played f4. Again, this pushes black back, but it's a rather committal move. Knight d7 was played. Vukic played e3. So, white's still a pawn up. Black's pressure persists along the open A and B files. It's a question of whether the pawn advances on the king side by white are weakening or strong. Black played queen to a3, tying down white's a pawn. And white played knight to a4. Knight b6. Finally, black gets the exchange of knights that he wanted. Knight takes b6, and black captured back with the rook. We reach a position where black has managed to exchange off the knights, and he has a perfectly satisfactory game, given that he's about to win white's a-pawn. This line with bishop d2 doesn't cause black too many problems. We now deal with an even more modest move than queen c2, namely rook e1. Now you'd expect after a move like that white would be intending to move his e-pawn forward. But very often the move e2, e4 turns out to be weak, for the main reason that black can then manoeuvre a knight into d3 with knight g4, knight coming round to e5, and then the knight into d3. And now to keep it simple, I'm going to recommend the same move as last time, that's queen to b6. Now in a way this sets a positional trap, because what white should play, and what white did play in the game we're going to look at, is h3. But if he plays e4, then you know what black should do. Knight f6 to g4, followed by the familiar manoeuvre knight e5. And black gets an excellent position. So this is why white takes time out for h3. Although the move's very time consuming, it's difficult for black to exploit it. We're now going to follow the game between Grandmaster John Spielman and Grandmaster William Watson, played in the 1985 Commonwealth Championship. Having been denied knight g4 to e5, Watson played rook f b8. Spielman played rook b1, and now black elected to play the long-winded knight manoeuvre knight e8. White played queen c2, and black played bishop to c4. White played knight d2, and black captured the pawn. Bishop takes a2. The rook went to a1. And now black played bishop takes knight on c3. It's worthwhile stopping at this moment to have a look at this capture a bit more closely. It's very rare that black would want to give up his king's bishop. But the point of this move is to win the pawn on d5. Black, after b takes c3, played bishop takes d5. Now this puts white in a quandary. If white were to play rook takes a8 now, the bishop on d5 recaptures. And now it's black that's got the extra pawn. Now white cannot play bishop takes d5 because of rook takes a1. So, replacing the pieces, we see that far from being a pawn down, black has retained his queenside pressure and emerged with an extra pawn. You may be wondering how white got into such a mess after bishop c4. But there were no easy replies to this move. For instance, if white were to just reply b3, then I think black's idea was bishop takes knight on c3, hitting the rook on e1, and after queen takes c3, to play bishop takes d5. Actually, maybe this is better than what Spielmann did from white's point of view, but it's still no way to try and get the advantage with white. Also, if white were to now play a3, then black could get his pawn back by playing bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, bishop takes d5. But he's actually got something better. That move is queen to b3. Very strong. Queen takes queen, rook takes queen. And now black has numerous threats. He threatens bishop takes knight. If white plays knight d2 now, again, bishop takes knight. Wins material. And if white doesn't play knight d2, then black is threatening to recover his pawn in several ways, and he also has the positional threat rook a to b8. Any way you look at it, white is completely tied down. A final 11th move alternative for white is bishop f4. And this has become popular in recent years thanks to the use of it by Predrag Nikolic, the Yugoslav Grandmaster. Again, I'm going to recommend queen b6. In this position, Nikolic usually plays rook b1, and in the game Lalic-Wilder, St John 1988, black played queen b7. White played rook e1, and black played, again, similar to the last example, bishop c4. Notice that the bishop on c4 is not only putting pressure on a2, combined with the rook on a8, but also on d5. And this is the theme behind black's play. Now, replacing bishop c4, putting the bishop back on a6, Wilder also mentions the possibility rook f b8. And we'll just take a look at his analysis, because it's interesting. After rook f b8, he suggests h3, again bishop c4, white plays b3, bishop takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, and now knight e5, uncovering an attack against the d5 knight by the g2 bishop. Now actually black is going to sacrifice the exchange in this position, but what he will get is a tremendous attack against the white king and all the black squares on the board. After knight e5, black should play d takes e5. Wilder recommends bishop takes d5, and now queen to c7. White grabs the exchange, bishop takes a8, and now here's the move which gives black the compensation. E takes f4. Here, white has the bishop under attack on a8 and the pawn under pressure at g3. Wilder recommends getting the bishop out of harm's way, bishop g2, and now black grabs on g3, f takes g3. White takes back, f takes g3, hoping that black will play queen takes g3 when the d7 knight hangs. But black has a useful intermezzo here. bishop c3, deflecting white's rook, rook f1. Now black plays a check, bishop d4 check, shielding the knight on d7 from attack. The king goes to h2, protecting g3, and now black plays the key move, h5, threatening to break into white's king position by playing the further advance, h4. If white stops that with, say, rook f3, then black can post his knight excellently with knight e5. You can see what I mean by dark squares. The bishop on d4 is a monster, the knight on e5 is very strong. Moreover, black still threatens the move h4. Probably this position is about level. Personally, I prefer to play black because he has the initiative. Back to the game now with black playing bishop c4. That was all just analysis. After bishop c4, white played b3, and black snapped the pawn off on d5. Bishop takes d5. White takes, knight takes d5, and this time round black took back with the queen. Queen takes d5. Again, this is an exchange sacrifice. Again, black gets decent compensation. Lulich played 16 knight d2, forcing the win of an exchange, and black responded queen h5. Of course, white took the exchange, bishop takes a8, and black recaptured, rook takes a8. Well, white has to be careful for a number of reasons. Firstly, black's threatening to take on a2. Secondly, there are threats of knight g4. It's difficult for white to defend against both of those threats. Moreover, black is actually threatening to push his centre with e7, e5, followed by d6, d5, running white's minor pieces out of play. So, although white's the exchange up, it's not very straightforward. White decided that saving the a2 pawn was a priority, so he played 18 a4, whereupon black got on with the business of advancing his centre by playing 18 e5. Now there's only one square for that poor bishop, that's bishop e3, and black played in the game d5. I wonder whether, if we retract the pawn to d6, knight g4 isn't a decent alternative. Probably black rejected that because of knight f1. So, replacing the pieces, black played d5, and this move threatens d4, swamping the bishop. So white had to come up with 20 f3. After f3, black played rook e8. White played bishop f2, and black played e4. White played pawn takes pawn. And now, according to Wilder, he should have played 22 knight g4. And this is the move I'm going to recommend. There's only one move for white which makes any sense after knight g4, and that's 23 knight f1, whereupon rook takes e4 gives black a strong attack. I feel black has excellent compensation for the exchange here. He's got a bind on white's position, and there are several threats, the most potent of which is simply to remove the bishop on f2 with knight takes f2, and then if the king takes on f2, black has attacking choices. He can play to bring his other knight into the game with knight f6 to g4 check. He may play bishop d4 at some point, or bishop c3. And there are also chances to get at the white king by playing, for instance, queen f5 check, or queen to h3, followed by h5, h4. These combined chances give black excellent compensation for the exchange. I think that black is doing fine in the fianchetto variation. In the lines I'm advocating with queen b6, in addition to the usual queenside pressure, black can try to gang up on white's d-pawn with moves like queen b7, bishop c4, and knight d7 to b6. The second main line of the Benko gambit accepted is where white goes for an early e4. The characteristic feature of the variation is that white allows black the possibility of exchanging on f1. Bishop takes f1, king takes f1, after which white is denied the right to castle. First, we'll take a look at a sharp line popularised by Grandmaster Yasser Seirawan. Play continues, 8d6, and now we get Seirawan's favourite move, 9g4. Well, when you're confronted with a move like this, I reckon that is developing your kingside as quickly as possible and creating normal Benko gambit play. For that reason, the simple move bishop g7 must be best. And now there are two moves for white. The mainline move, and most consistent, is 10g5. Black should play knight h5, and then white plays knight g to e2. We now follow the game Baumbach against Despotovich, a correspondence game. Usually correspondence games have the merit of unearthing many new ideas, and this game's no exception. After knight g2, black played a very clever move, queen c8. Generally, in the g4 variation, c8 is the very best square for the queen. On c8, the queen does two things. Firstly, and unpleasantly from white's point of view, the queen may threaten to zoom across to the king side, either to h3 or to g4. If white stops all these threats, the black queen may actually come out to the queen side, to either b7 or more likely to a6. So we can see that queen c8 is a very flexible two-way move. Now in the game Baumbach-Despotovich, Baumbach played king g2. Black played queen g4 check, and white played 13 knight g3. You might wonder why black has just provoked white into playing moves he seemed to want to play anyway. But the idea was knight f4 check. This knight's got to go. Bishop takes f4. And then black played queen takes f4. And white played h4. Just to show you that black wasn't worried by h4, he now castled. And white played rook h3. Now previously played in this position was the move knight to a6. And black started getting into trouble after a move like knight g to e2. But in this particular correspondence game, black came up with an excellent novelty here, and that was bishop takes c3. B takes c3, and now another excellent move, f6. The idea is clear, to expose the white king, and perhaps that's the weakness of the whole g4 variation. It's got some nice positional ideas behind it, getting space on the king side, etc, 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 but as long as black remembers to play queen c8, he's going to get pressure on the white squares, and ultimately pressure against white's king. And here you can see, despite the fact that white is still a pawn up, he's got severe problems with his king, and his major pieces in particular remain uncoordinated. Black has the advantage after this excellent sequence bishop takes c3 and f6. The game went on, 18 queen e2, black played f takes g5, h takes g5, and now another very good move, knight d7. The idea of knight d7 is clear, of course. Black wants to bring his knight to this wonderful central square, e5. Well, black can't be stopped from doing that, so white decided, okay, I've got the a pawn, I must push it. a4. Black played knight e5, and white played knight f1. Mainly, I think, to bring the rook on h3 into the game. Now another key move, c4. very fine, threatening to establish the knight on d3. Alright, white played queen e3, and black wasn't worried by the exchange of queens, played his knight into d3. If now, of course, white does exchange the queens, then the knight takes back, check, forking king and rook. So with f2 hanging, white now has to grovel with a horrible move, rook a2. After rook a2, black played queen e5, threatening knight f4 check, and white tried to neutralise black's pressure by playing rook f3. Rook takes f3 was a simple reply. King takes f3. And now another very simple move, queen takes c3. It seems to me all black's proven in this game so far is that throughout he had better coordination. I think from the point at which black played queen to c8, his position was excellently coordinated. And white, although he's tried hard, hasn't actually managed to counter this coordination with any ideas of his own. He pushed his a-pawn, it hasn't got very far, now his king's under fire, and actually black is probably threatening just to round up the a-pawn with a move like, for instance, queen b3. This is a most uncomfortable position for white, and he now had to grovel again with 26 king g2, after which queen b3 was an excellent reply, hitting both rook and a-pawn. Rook a1 was played, and black went for glory with queen b2. All about coordination, the whole thing. Rook went to d1, and black took on a4 with the rook. Rook d2 was played, although in a correspondence game you could almost forgive white for resigning this position. And black went back to e5. King h3 was played, and then the final move was rook a3. White had enough. He quit, saved himself a stamp. Returning to the position after g4, black responds bishop g7. The second white 10th move alternative is king g2. Now play is similar to the last variation, and here black could play a number of good moves. He can play either queen c8, with the same ideas as in the last section, or better still, play Fedorowicz's recommendation, just simply knight bd7. If white now plays f3, then Fedorowicz recommends knight e5, knight ge2, and now once again the key move, queen c8, with several ideas. Black threatens queen a6 with a possible incursion on d3, for instance queen d3 or knight d3. He may play h7 h5, which is one jolly good reason not to castle yet. You may wonder why black hasn't castled before. Well, it is an alternative, but I would say black can always castle. It's better perhaps to bring the knight to e5 first and play queen c8. It gives you a little bit more flexibility, and perhaps the move h5 shows why. After white recaptures the bishop on f1, he's probably threatening to go e4, e5. So for that reason, black should prevent e4, e5 by playing d6. White needn't be so ambitious with g4. Instead, he can play a more modest move, and that's g3, making a bolt hole for the king. Black plays bishop g7. White plays king g2. Black castles on the king side. White plays knight f3. And black plays knight bd7. And this is considered the main line position. of the line in which white allows black to take on f1. Now virtually the only thing white can do in this position is to play for the advance e4, e5. He can try to consolidate the queenside by setting up a pawn formation something like b3, a4, but it takes an awful long time to do that, and by the time he has set up that pawn formation, black's pieces are well entrenched on the queenside. To show you how this variation might go, we'll first of all follow the game Hjartarson from Iceland versus Lev Albert, another great exponent of the Benko gambit over many, many years. And this comes from a match between the Nordic countries and the United States in 1986. Hjartarson played 12 rook e1, considered to be the best move for white in this position. And I've chosen a move, although there are many moves for black here, which fits in with the idea of our repertoire, and simply that's queen to b6. White played rook e2. He wants to develop his bishop on c1, so he protects the b2 square with the rook. After rook e2, Albert played rook fb8. Perfectly normal Benko gambit move. But I think a better move is knight g4. Always be on the lookout for this opportunity when white hasn't played h3. In this case the knight's going to e5, and black puts familiar pressure on the white position from either c4 or d3. Although in the latter case he has to have his queen on a6 if he wants to threaten the move knight d3. Returning to Hjartarson Albert, Albert played rook fb8, and Hjartarson cut out the possibility of knight g4 by playing 14 h3. No matter, black played queen a6. White played the bishop out to g5, and black played h6. That's an interesting move by black, not common at all in the Benko to weaken your pawn position on the king side, but here I think black wants to move the knight on f6, and he can't do so just yet because the e7 pawn hangs, so he gives the bishop a kick. Hjartarson dropped his bishop back to e3, and black played knight b6. Can you see the way pressure's building on white's position? Here black has two separate threats with the knight on b6, either knight c4, putting pressure on the bishop on e3 and the pawn at b2, or the exchanging sequence with knight a4, which is possible of course because the white square bishops are off the board, and if white were to take that knight on a4, queen takes back, probably the queens come off, and then black has a really great position, although admittedly he's had one extra move. But this is the type of position black is aiming for. White now played rook c1, trying to get the a1 rook into play and also out of the gaze of black's bishop on g7. And black responded knight c4. White played b3, and black took on e3 with check. White recaptured with the rook. Probably in this position, white does in fact threaten the advance e4, e5, but black stops this comfortably enough with knight d7. And Hjartarson played a4. Now here, it looks as though white is actually doing very well. And indeed, if black allows white to play knight b5 unhindered, then I think white's probably winning. He's actually managed to set up his favourite pawn formation, b3, a4. He's got his rook out of the way of black's bishop, and the knight on b5 blocks the black rooks out of play. So this is the type of formation black has to strive against. Replacing the knight on c3, Albert played a very strong move now. He played c4, which breaks up the white game. Hjaltason played knight b5 anyway, and now black played a very strong move, c takes b3. Probably this was the move Hjaltason felt that black couldn't play, because of course white has the fork, knight c7, and this is exactly what white did. But Albert had something very strong in mind. He played queen takes a4, knight took on a8, and now an extremely strong move, not the routine capture on a8, but knight c5. Well, a move like knight c5 comes as a bit of a shock, even to a grandmaster. But Hjaltason recovered to play the only move, which was rook takes c5. If he'd played knight c7, then black can get a terrific endgame advantage by the simple move b2, whereupon white has two choices, neither of which are very palatable. If white now plays queen takes queen, black plays b takes c1, promoting to a queen, and has a lot of pressure. Or alternatively, if he plays rook b1, then black himself exchanges the queens. Queen takes d1, rook takes d1, black promotes to a queen, white takes on b1, and black takes back with the rook. Again, black has a clear advantage. Look at the knight on c7. It's got no squares. Similarly, the bishop on g7 is very strong. Each one of black's pieces is better than its white counterpart. Big advantage to black. So, white removed the knight that was giving him so much bother. And black took back. D takes c5. Well, obviously there was no hope for white, having just re-sacrificed the exchange, if he didn't now get his knight out of the hole on a8. So Hjaltason played knight c7. But of course that move allows c4. And you can see that black's pressure on the queen side now, with the two pawns coming down, combined with the bishop on g7, is really powerful. This is why Hjaltason hastens to try and block the bishop on g7 out of the game, with e5. Albert was up to that, played queen a5, hitting the knight and also threatening to push pawn to c3. Hjaltason played d6, b2, queen b1, and black pushed his pawn again with c3. Isn't this fun? Well, white thought he would get in on the act and played 29 e6, producing a rather comical position. And black played f takes e6. Now at this point, white played rook e1, and Albert missed a win. What he should play was queen to f5, which wins immediately, driving out the blockader, followed by unstoppable promotion. Instead, he played pawn takes d6, and the game went on for some time. Black eventually won. The final variation you need to know about in the king takes f1 line is similar to the last example, but this time white runs his king to h2. The line starts knight f3, bishop g7, and white now plays h3. This is a bit time consuming, but obviously white's king position is slightly more secure than in the last example. Moreover, he cuts out any possibility of black playing knight g4. But the line is slow, and black should be able to get good counterplay against it quickly. To start off with, black proceeds normally by castling, and white runs his king to h2, king g1, black plays knight bd7, and white runs his king up to h2. Well, this is white's idea. He's gone through with it. He's run his king to h2. But I'm going to recommend quick mobilisation with a typical move, queen b6. White normally runs his rook to e1. And now there are a couple of good ideas for black. The first, and probably the best move, is c4. The idea is that black's queen puts pressure on b2. And he threatens knight c5 and then knight d3. If white manages to find a way to stop all that, he still has to contend with the normal move, rook fb8. After the move c4, black is getting pressure. If you feel like playing something else, then knight e8 is quite a decent move. For instance, rook e2, knight e5, black is going through the routine of exchanging the knights, knight takes e5, and this time the position of the white king counts against him because black gains a tempo here. Bishop takes e5, check. King h1, and in the game Ogard Georgiou, Helsinki 1972, black just played knight c7. The game was drawn shortly after, but here black's certainly threatening knight b5, the knights come off, and there you are. Hey presto, the typical Benko gambit ending. Black has active pieces. Look at white's rook on a1, look at the bishop on c1, tied down. A different idea for white in the main line of the Benko gambit accepted is knight f3 in this position. Black plays d6 and white plays knight d2. The idea of this move is that white wants to play e4, and when black captures the bishop on f1, the manoeuvre knight f3 to d2 enables white to capture with the knight. The knight then emerges either to d2 or e3, and white can actually get his king out of the middle by castling in this position. So against this variation, although it's uncommon, black must be on the ball. What he can't do is allow an exchange of white squared bishops and let a white knight settle on c4. Now if it was so easy to refute the Benko gambit, everybody would play this line. And the obvious defect, to my mind at least, is that it's a rather slow idea by white. White simply spends too much time moving one knight around the board. And in the end, a fully developed black can eject the knight from c4 without too much trouble. Yet this was the line chosen by Yevgeny Barayev against Garry Kasparov in their game from the Linares tournament 1994. And we'll follow that game to see how black should ideally react. It's black to move in this position, and Kasparov played bishop g7. White went through with his plan, e4, and naturally black took on f1. Barayev recaptured with the knight, and black now played a very strong move, queen a5. Now, although that threatens in passing the move knight takes e4, obviously white's going to defend against that threat, and then we have to try and see why black put his queen out on a5. Well, I think it's because of the manoeuvre queen a5 to a6. Then you must watch out for that as the game goes on. That's a very influential square for the queen, because as usual black's putting pressure down the a file with his major pieces. But now that white's played e4, weaknesses begin to appear on the c4 and d3 squares. And not only does the queen on a6 stop a white knight from coming to c4, it also prepares the entry of a black knight into the game to either d3 or maybe even c4. Barayev defended against the threat of knight takes e4 with a simple move, bishop d2, and Kasparov castled. White played knight e3, and black played knight bd7. White castled, and black played queen a6. White played queen c2, and now Kasparov played a new move, although it's hardly a surprising move in view of our earlier comments, knight e5. So here we see an excellent position for black in this knight d2 line. Black has pressure down the a6 f1 diagonal. His knight's threatening to come to d3 and c4. And there's also a threat of rook f to b8. Pressure all the way. After knight e5, Barayev stopped the knight from coming into c4 by playing b3. Kasparov played knight fd7, a complicating move. He could equally have played rook f b8. Barayev played f4, and black put the knight in on d3. Now white played a3. A funny looking move, but the idea is simple. He wants to stop the black knight from coming to b4. After a3, I think that white is now in a position to threaten knight c4, which explains Kasparov's next move, bishop into d4, pinning the knight. Unsurprisingly, white went king h1. But now, a different move from Kasparov. You might expect rook f b8. Instead, he played rook f c8. This move really strikes at the heart of the position, because black is going to blow the game up at some point by playing c5 to c4. Of course, the move that white wants to play in this position is knight c4, but at present that seems to fail to knight f2 check. So, white went on, rook a b1, and black played c4. White played b4, and black played knight to f6. Earlier on, you'll recall I discussed pawn structure on the queen side, and I said it was unwise to allow white the possibility of getting two passed pawns. Yet this is what precisely Kasparov has done. Now, knight f6 is a very specific move. Black's threatening bishop takes knight on c3, followed by knight takes e4. The power of this idea is shown up after white plays a4, which Barayev rejected. Bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, knight takes e4, and if white now plays a5, then Kasparov recommends the move queen b5, and he says that white has a poor game here. White has two passed pawns on the queen side, but at the moment they're tied down. Black has the b pawn under pressure, and white's bishop on c3 is not particularly good. Advantage to black. For that reason, Barayev plays what at first looks like a very grovelly move, knight e to d1. But at second sight we see he's covered the immediate threat of bishop takes c3, and on d1 the knight also covers the f2 square. Kasparov played rook c to b8, and the knight came back to e3. Rook c8. So there's been a small repetition of moves here. And now Barayev played b5. It's worth dwelling on what might happen if white repeats the position with knight e d1. Then Kasparov recommends rook a b8 with the idea queen a2, queen a7. And he says black holds the advantage here. Black is threatening knight g4 with serious pressure against f2. If white were to stop that move with h3, weaknesses start to appear on the king side, and then black can consider softening up the white king by playing h5 and then h4. It's very difficult for white to undertake anything in this particular position. That's why Kasparov feels black has the edge. After b5, black played queen b6, and white thought he saw the chance for a tactic, playing 24 knight takes c4. Kasparov played knight f2 check, rook takes f2, rook takes c4. And now white's really under pressure. Black threatens to double rooks on the c-file. He threatens the white rook on f2. He's probably threatening knight g4 as well. This means that white has one move and one move only in this position, and that is rook f3. Black took on a3 with the rook, and white went queen b2. Now comes a small error from Kasparov. He played knight takes e4. Retracting that move, he feels it's a better chance for black to keep up the pressure by playing rook a8, although the move as played in the game worked well enough. After rook a8, black is just threatening to double on the c-file with great pressure. He also threatens knight takes e4 as played. I think the world champion's play in this game was excellent, and certainly his opening play was indeed excellent. It's the very line you should be adopting as black when somebody plays knight f3 and knight d2. A final line which has found favour with aggressive white players is the move f4 here. Now that looks extremely bizarre, but white's idea is to play knight f3 and then e4, grabbing the centre. When black takes on f1, as he probably must in a position like this, white can do two things. He can take with the rook and then play his king to f2 and then g1, castling artificially. Or, and this has been played, he can take on f1 with the king, again leaving the rook on h1, just playing in the centre. But I think I've come up with an idea which can frustrate this entire white system. After f4, black should play d6, as normal. White plays knight f3, and now the key move, an early queen a5. The main point of this move is that it prevents white from playing e4, the move he wants to play, because then of course black just snaps that pawn off. So the main line runs after queen a5. 9 bishop d2, bishop g7, e4, and then Fedorowicz reckons it's best not to take on f1 in this position, but to castle. The idea being that if white takes on a6 with the bishop, black takes back with the queen. Queen takes a6. Again, keeping the white king in the centre and taking the sting out of the thrust e4, e5. Right, well, what's white to play here? I mean, it's very difficult for him. If he can't castle, he's got to try and somehow justify the reckless advance of his pawns in the centre. Queen e2, knight bd7, queen takes a6, rook takes a6, and observant viewers might notice that this is a very similar position to one we were analysing in the introduction. In fact, the game between Andrei and Fedorowicz. In fact, if white now played King D1, we would actually transpose to that game. And you remember what happened to the white king in that game, don't you? He got mated on the A file. Another Fedorowicz game from this position went castles long. But I guess the objections to castles long are the same as for King D1. You have to ask yourself, is white king on C1 really where it wants to be? So after castles long, Fedorowicz recommends knight G4, threatening the fork on F2. White plays rook H F1. And then he thinks black should simply play bishop takes C3, B takes C3, and then rook takes A2, with serious pressure for black. Summing up, if black remembers to play Queen A5 at the right moment in this line, he not only neutralises all of white's threats, he gets the better game. I'm sure now that you can see that the Benko is an opening worth trying. I play the opening myself, and I really trust these positions for black. If white accepts the gambit pawn, I believe that black gets a highly promising game. Master the information on this video and study the games in the booklet. Then get out there and go for it.